So let's start. Good morning, everyone. We would like to welcome you to this webinar, Wiser 2020. Thank you for being here. For us as organizers, the organizers of SIPLA, of the International Secretariat of the Indigenous and Afro-Descendants People and HIV, we are happy to be here. This has been an event that has taken place every 2 years, and we gather at the International AIDS Conference. Today, we face a new challenge, obviously, because we are in the COVID-19 pandemic. So let's hope that everyone is healthy and that in this context, we can access the technology so that we can enjoy the technological development. We know that some of our relatives do not have access to these tools, but let's hope that we can carry out this conference the best way possible. Before we start, I would like to have a ceremony. This is a ceremony that we do in some of the indigenous communities in Latin America and elsewhere. It is a way to thank the earth for allowing us to be here, for blessing us and taking care of us, and for giving us the natural elements that we need to survive. So now I would like to ask every participant to look around you and find a natural element. These natural elements can be water, soil, fire, flowers, fruit. And this is going to be an offering. We are going to give this to our Mother Earth. And this is a way to thank her for letting us be here. Let's start. I would like all of the speakers to turn on their cameras. Jose, if you can turn on your camera, please. Now, take one of these elements in your hands. You're going to have it in your hands, and you are going to say a few words of what it is or what does it mean to have this element with you. And then you're going to offer it to Mother Earth. I would like to start by Trevor, because this pre-conference is being held in North America, close to his territory. So Trevor, you can start.
Thank you very much, Pilar. I'm going to show you where I am here in my house. And I want to show you a couple of items here. I have lit a smudge. This is silver sage. It's from the prairies of central Canada. And what it does is it's a cleansing. It's before you speak to Creator or with Mother Earth, it's a good idea to cleanse your spirit so that all of the residue from the other spirits or other people, the energy that's not yours, is cleaned away, and it's only you, clean you, speaking to Creator one-on-one, and Creator recognizes us in this way. In last year in Montreal, a very important Mohawk elder passed this eagle fan to me, and this eagle fan has been working for 30 years helping people, and I was honored with this eagle feather, this eagle fan, to do this work. And of course, there's always water here, which is the first medicine for Indigenous people here. And I hold this for my son for when he's ready to take on the responsibility. So thank you for allowing me to share, Pilar.
Gracias, Trevor. Quiero darle ahora la palabra a nuestra hermana Amaranta.
Thank you, Trevor. Now I would like to pass the mic to Amaranta. She's in Mexico. Okay, thank you, Pilar. I have this flower. In Zapoteco, we call it yechachi. And in Spanish, we call it the flower of May. We have plenty of these flowers in May. May for us is a month of festivities. Our culture is very festive. We try to celebrate happiness and enjoyment of what we have. I think this represents me. I also have it in my head because part of our festivities in our communities, what this flower symbolizes is well-being. Right now, in this digital version of the conference, or the pre-conference rather, I just realized when you asked for this element, I realized how today, due to COVID, we have been impacted in our communities, mainly in the festive way of living, obviously also in the economic way or in the economy of our peoples, because the economy is also based on festivities. So I would like to bring this up, and I have this plant in my house, and having it in my head feels like I am in a festivity, in a festival, in a celebration. Even if we are going through hardship, we still need to be happy, and we still need to thank the Mother Earth that is offering us these elements. Thank you, Amaranta. You are perfectly right. COVID has taken away some of our practices in the indigenous communities. Now, Jose, you can turn on your mic from Guatemala. Thank you, Pilar. Thank you for welcoming me. Hello, Amaranta. Hello, Trevor. We are in different regions, and we are sharing this unity for work. Also, I would like to share with you this altar that I built. I have corn here. This represents the Mayan culture, the fire that I am going to lit right now, because they have taught us that before you speak about indigenous peoples, you need to ask for permission. So I want to ask for permission from my grandparents, from the elders and indigenous peoples who have given their lives to change the world, so that the indigenous communities can improve themselves and they can have well-being. Thank you for being here in the Mayan lands. We are with Nahual in the Mayan culture, and we have the Family Day and Earth's Day. This has just happened, and this led us to talk about dignity and our culture. Thank you, Jose. Thank you for that brief ceremony that you shared with us. Finally, I would like to share an element that I gathered. This is a traditional element in my culture. They are seeds. Seeds are part of the Huanca culture. We have been here for thousands of years. We produce 60% of the food in Peru. And these seeds represent, each one of the seeds represents each one of us. We have a role to play in our communities, in our territories, and in the world. We don't want to disappear. So we have to be this seed that we're offering to the world, so that our traditions and knowledge can keep going through the time. Thank you. And I would also like to ask everyone who's participating in this session to have a natural element close to you. Maybe you can have it on the side. If you are participating from an indigenous event, you can have a natural element near you, because it helps you feel closer to Earth. So let's keep our elements close to us on the side. And now we're going to start.
Quiero
I would like to start these presentations with Amaranta. Amaranta is an indigenous Mushe woman in Huatepec, Oaxaca, Mexico. She has been an activist at the local and international level. She is the founding leader of the International Secretariat of the Indigenous Peoples and HIV and Human Rights. Currently, she is the co-president of the working group, the International Indigenous Working Group for HIV. Also, she is the candidate to become the president of the Committee to Prevent Discrimination in Mexico. So, Amaranta, we welcome you. And you can start with your session.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor. I want to greet all our siblings who have been with us all the time. For instance, Jose Cruz from Tabasco. He's been with us since the 2008 conference. Right now, I have to talk, or I would like to talk to you about what has happened ever since 1999 until 2019. We're already in 2020. But I want to reflect on what has been the reaction in Latin America in terms of the response to HIV/AIDS. I'm going to use a tool that we presented last year. We were in a gathering for science and HIV in Mexico, and we, as SIPLA, the Latin American Network of HIV Topics, Affairs, and we, together with other academic people, made this report. It was a report about the state of the art and the situation that is prevailing in terms of HIV. All this happening within indigenous communities. Next one, please. As I was telling you, there is an origin for all this. It started in 1999 in Ottawa. There, I had the opportunity to take part for the first time in a movement. I could see that in Canada, in the US, in Australia, and in New Zealand, indigenous peoples were already getting together to speak about the issues of HIV. Then they added Mexico in a first symposium. Since then, in Mexico particularly, we could start working and making it more visible. We wanted to show that this epidemic was becoming rural. It was reaching the peoples. From Ottawa, we went to another one. There were different points since 1999. We started to work with many indigenous peoples to show the pressing need to address HIV in our communities. We needed to show the impact of this HIV/AIDS epidemic on indigenous bodies. We also had to show indigenous communities around the world, and we needed to show them the need to do it, to address HIV in a cultural, pertinent way. For a long time, ever since Toronto 2006 and Mexico 2008, and all the way to Amsterdam 2018, we have had, and we still have, the opportunity to be together with these spaces. We could work in a work group in which we have Pilar, Jose, Trevor. We're working, and also leveraging all what is offered in these international conferences within the IAS, the International AIDS Society. We're working on these satellite conferences or these kind of pre-conferences. We're trying to show what is important, and that it is important to take into account indigenous peoples living with HIV. These pre-conferences have provided the space to discuss lessons learned, community experiences, and learn from all those. It has also allowed us to access other communities. These communities have been suffering this epidemic too, for instance, sexual workers, trans communities, etc. We also had times and moments that were key to establishing a dialogue with the International AIDS Society itself. With this, we could be included in this global agenda. And we could also get in touch with other organizations, for instance, the Pan American Health Organization, the World Health Organization, or the International Labor Organization. We have always needed the press, of course, to be able to convey our message, to broadcast what we needed to say. Therefore, the pre-conferences and the AIDS conference that is taking place right now has provided a good opportunity to broadcast our work. There are two very important moments for Latin America. It was the pre-conference in Toronto 2006 and the pre-conference in Mexico 2008. From Toronto to Mexico, we brought the conference. And when we brought the conference to Mexico, it gave us the opportunity to open it. It was actually the first time that we would have this conference in Latin America. That allowed us to understand that it was necessary to bring about some leadership. It was already happening in other places. And we took Mexico as the opportunity to bring people from Peru, Bolivia, Argentina, Colombia, and many other places or locations in the region. We worked for over 10 days and we discussed the situation. Ever since then, we were able to see that there were no public policies that were actually addressing indigenous people's interests. And actually, pandemics like the one we're living right now, the COVID-19 pandemic, come to show us which are our weaknesses, what we should be doing. Many times people are talking about our communities, but epidemics and pandemics then show our cultural and societal weaknesses. For instance, discrimination or marginalization. In 2008, we could generate the International Secretariat of Indigenous Peoples for HIV, Sexuality, and Human Rights. This created a group of leaders who had been working for many years on forums for Latin America, regional forums, etc. There, we could speak about community actions, education, dialogues, also, for instance, radio soap operas in which we could use the language for prevention. We would also be producing posters in our own languages. Also, some campaigns on antiretroviral with our cultural traditional components, etc. We were also speaking about mobilizing funds. Many of the interventions that we do require funds, of course, and this is why we were also discussing that. Therefore, SIPLA was supported by this indigenous social capital and devices. It had already been worked. You see the image there? That is the cover of one of the most tangible results that we had. It is very important too. After 10 years, we try to consolidate all the experience. Institutions always said to us, we want data. We don't epidata. We want projections. But many reports did not have those pieces of information, because many times their own tools could not be adequately be adapted to what we needed. Of course, they're important data, but most data is mainly centered. So what aim did we have with this report? We wanted to review what had been done and what was being done. Everything related to HIV, sexuality, and human rights in Indigenous peoples and communities. We wanted to have this research to set the basis for building that epidata database that we needed, and we still need it, as a matter of fact. But with this report, we can start thinking on the design of pertinent, ethnically pertinent public policies, access to treatment, etc. I will explain this later. The specific objectives were mapping and describing the sociocultural factors, mainly sociocultural factors, of this epidemic in Indigenous peoples in Latin America. We also had to document the access to healthcare in Indigenous peoples in Latin America. We also had to link with medical areas to see access and also treatment. We also had to describe the main recommendations. With this, we could make proposals or recommendations for public policies. But mainly, it was very important for us to emphasize gaps. Those gaps that we still need to bridge. The problems with access to prevention and care, together with the social society, with the government, and with the IAS. Here's some data. We can see some analysis roots in the study. We can see the social differential vulnerability of Indigenous communities. We can also see the tremendous structural violence. These act as factors for negation of rights, for instance, migration, racism, in terms of gender, etc. Sometimes we don't want to talk about sexuality in our communities, and they don't want to acknowledge that there is HIV. This study makes it obvious that there are erotic practices, there's erotization, there's desire, there's libido, and of course, this will also be related to STDs. I would like to continue by saying that there are certain studies that we can provide you some links to. You can see what has been done in Paraguay or Brazil. For instance, there you can see that uses and customs generate some supremacy that put sexual health at risk, mainly for women, and that happens very often in the Latin American community. These are important recommendations to take into consideration. There is something very important. When we talk about healthcare and timely access to treatment, we see in this study that in many peoples, they still don't know in the communities about HIV. They still don't know that there's rapid testing. If we want to achieve the 2020 target, we need that. There are many peoples or communities that do not know that there are antiretroviral treatments. We need to make this known so that we're not late for treatment access. Or sometimes the case is that access is in the city, perhaps 8 hours away from where the person lives. Perhaps that person will not have the means to reach that center, or that it will take too long to do it. There are very important barriers that we have to see in Latin America. We have to take into consideration, mainly in terms of language. We need a bilingual system in our healthcare centers. We need indigenous doctors. We need bilingual doctors that will be able to go beyond any barriers, any linguistic barriers. They need to overcome communication barriers so that they can provide a real access to healthcare. CPS role, I think, today and throughout the years has been provoking and encouraging other valuable efforts. These efforts are important in the region. For instance, I am very happy that in Chile we had a network, REMPO. It is a network created by our sibling and colleague. It is a network of indigenous people living with HIV. It started with the Mapuche people, but then it expanded to more peoples. That way, from Mexico in 2008, in that conference, we somehow encouraged this kind of effort and we celebrated and supported. CPA has also facilitated strategic forums in Central America and Latin America. We try to establish links with the communities and the governments. And now, last year, together with the international work group with Trevor and other colleagues, we're working in a dialogue, an open, honest conversation with the agencies and the governments. The main objective is translating this report into concrete facts, something that indigenous peoples will be able to access timely. I want to finally acknowledge all the work that has been done in Latin America. I want to recognize Alexis Escobar from Bolivia, Jose, who's here from Guatemala, our colleague Pilar Montalvo, Willy Morales from Chile, and many other people who have been accompanying this process, who have been promoting this process. We come from the communities and we understand that. Having this document is a tremendous step for us. We need to translate that into public policies. There has been a group of consultants who work together with us to issue this document, and we can share this with you. This is what I wanted to say. On behalf of CPA, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Amaranta, for this nice review of what CPA has been doing. The International Secretariat, and it started working since the Mexico 2008 conference. They also wanted to be part of the response to the epidemic. I also would like to say that you can make your comments and leave any questions in the chat. And then after our speakers are done speaking, you can do it. Now I give the floor to Jose Martin-Yac. He is from Guatemala. He is the legal representative of the research of Society of Guatemala. He's also secretary of the Adolescents Organization, and he also is part of many international organizations, within which we can say IHAC. He is also a university professor of political science in Aldivar University in El Satenalgo in Guatemala. So I give you the floor.
Thank you very much, Pilar, for your words. It is an honor for me to be able to be here today and share with us, or with everyone, the efforts that we are carrying out in order to make sure that the Indigenous rights are respected. I'm going to share with you a presentation that I have created in order to create analysis and critical thinking about the situation of Indigenous peoples. This is a response to the global objectives. First of all, I would like to say that I give great value the fact that I am part of the international networks for Indigenous peoples as a response to HIV, SIPLA. I work together with Amaranta. She just shared the chronological path that SIPLA has walked through. I give a lot of value to this effort because I have lived these sacrifices with them, not being able to sleep and making sure that we make Indigenous voices heard. It is true that the Indigenous peoples are the new characters of the international arena, but mainly in HIV, I think we have gained the recognition. So I want to congratulate everyone for making this a reality. Pilar Montalvo is part of this team, of this response team. It is also for me an honor to be part of the International Indigenous Working Group on HIV and AIDS. Together with the coordinator, Trevor, he has collaborated greatly in the work in the region. So I want to congratulate you for your efforts. What have we learned in these last 20, 30 years of our efforts? As Amaranta was mentioning, first of all, we have become the protagonizing actors of the activism in the region. We have created organizations around the response to HIV, but the Indigenous peoples had to be included in these efforts because we're talking about our lives, we're talking about our lands. And we're saying that we have the right to make our voice heard. We're part of the solution. When this epidemic just started, I don't know if you remember, but people were saying that the Indigenous peoples didn't have any knowledge about HIV. It is true, we still have some knowledge to acquire, but we could find the joint efforts with the community leaders, the healers, the elders, all of these people who have been working with the health of our communities, and they do it with the conviction and the skill set to make sure that everyone can be healthy. We have also the solar calendar to look for the response. So what have we accomplished in Latin America? First of all, I would like to show you this slide. This is an effort that we have accomplished in the last 3 years. In 2017, together with IGUA and SIPLA, we were able to establish regional works guided by a protocol. We didn't have enough data of the epidemic, but the response had to be consistent with the epidemic that we were facing. We needed to make sure that the Indigenous peoples were on the front line. So the first thing that we found was to work in this protocol. This protocol allowed us to start working towards cleaning our data and to create the research, the scientific research, to make sure that the Indigenous peoples were part of the process. Yes, we have seen this epidemiologic history, and the indigenous peoples have just been an object of studies. We have been used, but we have never been part of the response, of the answer, of the results. We never know what are the intentions of the researches that sometimes are carried out in our communities. So we said this cannot be the case. So we had the opportunity to work for more than a week in Satenango, in the city, below the volcano Santa Maria. This place is named as Xelajú in Guatemala. And we were able to establish the framework of a protocol. And I want to emphasize this declaration because we said that the indigenous peoples should be included in the actions for the development, design, and spread of investigation. This should include the indigenous peoples because we said that we are part of the response and we should be able to generate our own data with our tools, with our logic. So this was our way to contribute to the response in the local level. Also have the input of the health ministry, yes, but we also needed to include the universities, scientifics, academic researchers, but anything that went through the indigenous communities had to be accepted by the indigenous peoples. Now, we had this theoretical development, and I created this slide because I think that the indigenous peoples throughout the HIV epidemic, starting in 81 to the current times, we see that we haven't been able to focalize our work because there is a logic in the collective action. Sometimes we're marginalized, facing the structure. This structure sometimes has the sole purpose to increase budget, a budget that needs labor, people who can work for them, but they do not care about the people. I think that the social movements have been able to change this and create this change. And how have they done this? By making their voices heard, by exposing their realities. And they have been able to be successful. However, when we are talking about indigenous peoples, we talk about different investments, not only activism in the traditional sense. This is not necessarily the only tool that the indigenous peoples can use, because sometimes we're just particular movements because we have internal logics, internal interests, and these are sometimes portrayed when nature is being affected. Why? Because we're talking about the important elements of Mother Earth. And these are going to belong to future generations, to our children, our grandchildren. Our Mayan grandfathers said that. The struggle is real and it's continuous, and our children and grandchildren have to continue with this fight, with this struggle. So I think that all of these requests have a different focus, because when you talk about health, it is not the same as talking about disease. We're not talking about a power dynamic, because this leads to racism in the response. What we're talking about is lives, the community logic, our relationship with the earth, with the plants, with the mountain, the river. And what we're trying to do is have a holistic perspective. The perspective of the indigenous peoples is not focused only in the disease. When we talk about indigenous peoples, for example, in the West, we realize that what we are trying to find is equilibrium with the earth. So what we have accomplished at the regional level, mainly in Latin America, is that we are using the human rights as guidelines. We have countries in Latin America that have been recognized by the United Nations as indigenous communities. The interpreter apologizes. I cannot hear. The union groups have to work towards the self-determination, and everything that has to do with indigenous interests have to pass by their permission by the indigenous peoples. We have to focus and asking them, because we're talking about their interests. We're talking about an organized community. We have our own interpretation of the world, our own interpretation, our health. We're also saying that this region has ratified the United Nations Declaration on Indigenous Peoples, and throughout the efforts that have been carried out by United Nations, we have become part of different organizations and bodies to respect the indigenous rights. And this is established in the declaration. And the Latin American countries have ratified this treaty. So this is important to when we talk about the national response. The Latin American countries have been adapted, have been showing their logics, their perspectives on these topics. Also, we have rights that have been consolidated in the region. Central America, for example, has made sure to have a list of the rights. Guatemala, for example, did this for the peace agreements, and they have been doing this by signing and ratifying the peace agreements. And this has been necessary as part of the response. Also, we have to recognize that the Permanent Forum of the Indigenous Issues have issued different practices and knowledge as part of the political organization. This means to let the indigenous peoples react to this pandemic in their own way, using their healers and their knowledge. Also, we should mention the SDGs. All of the objectives that we have, the indicators that we have to start with the efforts to start a dialogue with indigenous peoples, to have the indicators that would help us reach the global goals with the indigenous peoples. We cannot talk just about creating data, because we're talking about human beings. We're talking about people who think, who have a connection with the earth, with their community. So we have to analyze what is the state versus the nation. And how do we understand nation? We understand nation as a feeling of belonging, as the emotions that we feel when we're part of something, when we're part of the response. And I believe that we haven't really filled this gap. Sometimes we just talk about state and we don't talk about nations. Sometimes we don't feel as part of a Western country because we're talking about Western methodology. So we don't feel we belong there. But we need that the nation, our lives, our emotions, our happiness is respected and guaranteed by the state. Now, I have some general data here from Latin America. We say that this is a region that has 826 indigenous communities. It's a very peculiar region. This map that I'm showing you is the representation of the geographic presence of the indigenous communities. this is very interesting because this is how we need to talk about the regional scope. We're talking about diversity. We're talking about lives that have been able to endure the colonization. We haven't died. We're here, we're alive. And we need to recognize that this region has become the cemetery of many people. There are many indigenous communities that have lost their language, their traditions, their clothing, and they have stopped feeling proud of what they are because we are in a region that rejects them. So this is a graph that really, really interests me. Afterwards, in the global region, all Latin America has been committed with the global goals. We're committed to reaching the 90-90-90 goal. In 2015, 16, and 17, with SIPLA and IGWA, we created a campaign. And we thought that the 10-10-10 that was missing was the indigenous peoples. And we couldn't reach 100 if we were not included as a community. These are the global goals. We have the resources. Developed countries have this very clear. But indigenous communities who are living without being recognized in the laws, in the national laws, cannot do this. And this is a tragedy. We were not only talking about, we were talking about lives that could be lost if we didn't achieve this. We also need to recognize that the infrastructure for health is poor. The UN Program for Development in Latin America has some data saying that these states are focalized in the center, in the capital city, and indigenous peoples are not, or the periphery is not being taken care of. So the institutions are generating racism. They come late, they lack knowledge, and they create racism. The ancient knowledge is not being recognized. What happened in Guatemala was a clear example. It was the death of a Mayan scientific. He had been an activist, and he wanted to make sure that the ancient health knowledge was spread, and he was burned by his own community because they thought he was a witch. So here we can see how the colonization process are still in our mindset. We need to burn what's different. We are scared, and this has led to the killings of people. We have other diseases like tuberculosis, hepatitis, diabetes, and they are all arriving to our communities. We need to understand how to face these diseases. What we have been doing is not focused on a broad scope. The cases of HIV are increased. The risk of contracting this is higher. Living with HIV is very complicated in these communities. We still lack accurate data. We have to rely on the state to have the data. I would like to give an example of Guatemala again. The cultural attention that we give in that Senado, we make sure that we have to ask the people, how are you? How is your face? What is your face telling me? When we have contact with them, they open up. They tell us what is happening. We can tell them, take your pill. You can take your pill with your meal. And this has made our approach more successful, but we're still scared. When we say that this is a need, They tell us that it is only a political perspective, that it is the politician who decides what is the response that we're going to have. And this is really sad. That is why we lack data. I think that the region has been affected by HIV. We need to understand how Indigenous people live, where we are, what are our interests. Many people think that Indigenous communities are poor. However, we know Indigenous peoples who are businessmen, who have business in New York, in Europe. So we have to let go of that stigma. It is important to recognize and acknowledge that being Indigenous is not the same as being underdeveloped. If we follow the data of the region, they say that in the region there are 1.8 million of infected people, but that's not right. There are more people who are being infected by HIV. Of the 826 communities that we have, there's a big percentage that is affected by this. Why? Because we lack the structure, we lack the infrastructure. What have we achieved in the last 20 years? First, the efforts that we have carried out in the region. We have to use the capacity of the Indigenous people as part of the response. We are part of the coordinator mechanism in the country. For example, in Guatemala, we have been part of the response. We represent Indigenous peoples. We try to emphasize that it is necessary to intervene, to have a decentralization of the power, and this has to be based on human rights. Also, at the national level, we have the regional organizing mechanism. We have the action plan at the regional level, and the high leaders of the state gathered in 2018 in the old city of Guatemala, and they committed to have an action plan that responds to the Indigenous interests. These topics include climate change, energy, water, health, amongst others. So I think it is very important to mention this. We have generated the protocol for research in Indigenous peoples facing the HIV, including Indigenous peoples, making them take part of this and have leaders that take part of this. Like this, we can give our contribution to the scientific evidence. Every time that we have to put forward our requests in front of the people who are in charge of making decisions, or, for example, in front of the fund for the fight against HIV, they tell us that first we need to become scientifics, that we need to have information that is important. We have done this. We have used the alternative means, for example, the community radio, dances, music, the kawawili, for example, the bird dance. The kawawili, which is a dance, is great because we found an explanation of what it is to be fearful, which are our secrets, so that we can face this as a response of HIV, so that we can talk with our siblings, so that we can put the information in their language. We have coverage, health coverage, for example. In the MISLO, we worked here for 20 years. This happened before. Now we're working in the collective rights. This was a 10-year plan. So we needed to have an organization that was surrounded by this, to include the ancestral knowledge, and this was key. We have the grandmothers, the healers, the people of the communities, the farmers, the people who work in agriculture. And they kept saying every time that the birds are singing, they bring us information. And we use this for prevention, for treatment, and this helped us greatly. The access for treatment, it must be a right. Same for testing. Having the tests to the community, brought to the communities, using the infrastructure that they have in the community, and then after the testing, we need treatment. This is key. This is key to have the data that we need. And also what we have achieved in the region, Amaranta already mentioned this, IGUA and SIPLA have been in different spaces. For example, we are a point of reference with HIV, we have dialogues with WHO, and we have recommended different things that are important so that we can have a model to intervene. We worked with ILO also, and this effort was very important for us. What was our perception of the people who were living with HIV? Do they have stigmatization? We live in a world of costumes, and we legitimize that the discrimination, and we think that it's normal to live like that.
We think it's normal to live like that, but it's not. This is why it's so important to have spaces, international conferences. I want to specifically highlight the participation in the Forum for Indigenous Affairs. We've been present in the forum in 2017 and 2018. We could carry out roundtables. We could have a political participation, and within the permanent forum, we could participate. We could make our requests. We could show them as that we could be our right arm to make significant changes. It is also important to recognize, to acknowledge that nothing can be decided without us. It is important to take into consideration the informed, free, previous survey should have the right channels and methodology to reach us. Indigenous peoples need to have access and be consulted on any kind of research involving them. This is why we want to have inclusive public policies so that we could have a collaborative work. Which are the challenges that the Latin American community has to face? Illegal political marginalization. We have to have focalized tools within the regions. We also have to recognize or acknowledge that we have poor access to healthcare, education, rights, sexual and reproductive rights. And I don't even know if I should call them like that, because more than 70% of Indigenous people, the interpreter apologizes, the speaker is breaking. We have to address discrimination and all those fundamentalist elements that have grown so much, and we still have to work against those within the region. The lack of acknowledgement strategy for public policies. Finally, I want to say that the challenges that we will be facing, one of them is we should have a joint agenda. All groups should work together. We should think of the region and project 20 or 30 years forward, just like our ancestors did. Think in the long term. Try to achieve those results. Promote and develop research that will allow us to understand how Indigenous people living with HIV live. We also have to try and find better ways of reaching our 1990 targets, working together with the communities to have a more holistic understanding, working together with the agencies in each country to understand how healthcare is organized, and also include those factors that will support adherence to medicine. We also have to promote tests and therapies with antiretrovirals. One of the main challenges that I find is adapting preventive comprehensive strategies to the indigenous peoples. We have to make the modification of the testing, for instance, home testing, and we have to provide access to pre-ed. But all of this has to do with the indigenous vision. And if we can legitimize this from the movement, we will be able to guarantee better results. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jose, for that nice summary. It is very interesting and important. You reviewed all the activities that SIPLA has been organized as part of the international group. It's important that you mentioned the 169 Convention of the ILO. It shows our individual and collective rights as indigenous peoples. Many countries have signed it, but the progress has been quite little regarding pre-consultation regarding healthcare. And as you mentioned, if we don't include human rights and discrimination in our policies, we will always be lagging behind. But we, as leaders, will always be watching those points, making the claims, and raising our voices. Thank you very much. I want to give the floor to Trevor. Trevor Stratton is a 54-year-old Two-Spirit citizen of the Mississaugas of Credit First Nations near Toronto, in Canada. He is the new coordinator of the International Indigenous Working Group on HIV and AIDS, and he is working within the Canadian Aboriginal Network, AIDS Network. He is also the executive director of the International Indigenous HIV/AIDS Community, IHAC. And in March 2019, he won the Red Ribbon Award from the Canadian Association for HIV Research. He's also an activist. He's also a facilitator. He's working in multiple spaces, and we thank him here for all the work he is doing for all Indigenous peoples around the world. Now, I give the floor to Trevor. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to tell you a little story. So let's get on with this, shall we? So there we go. Is it working? It's not letting me share. Any tech support?
Sí, no te escuchamos, Trevor.
I'm not able to share my screen here.
Ok. Quizás yo puedo compartir tu presentación.
I can't share my...
Maybe I will be able to share your presentation.
And I have a little technical support. Can't share screen. And I'm using Chrome. Do we have any technical support?
Pilar, tal vez tú puedas hacer eso.
Emma.
Por favor. Gracias.
Disculpa, Maranta. Making sure you opened the file first.
Yes, it's open.
you've opened it and then you go to share screen and application window, and can you see it in there?
Hit share screen application window. I see the window.
Yeah, and you click on it and it should have a blue frame and then
Yeah,
a share button.
and then
at the
share.
bottom. Yeah, let me see.
Yeah, it looked like it worked, but it's not doing anything.
Okay, do you want to try and share your entire, you have your entire screen, you see an application window, you see your file, sorry?
I do.
Yeah.
I go share screen, and
yeah.
then it goes, I click on it, it goes blue, and then I can click on share.
Yeah.
And nothing happens.
Okay. Let me just see, Pilar, do you have the file that Trevor's trying to share? Otherwise, I can share it if you email it to me quickly, just so I
Okay.
don't interrupt.
I'll have to email you.
Yo tengo la presentación de Trevor.
I have Trevor's presentation, but I have it in PDF.
También va a unirse ahora a la conversación.
Janessa puede compartir.
Okay, then Janessa can share it.
Let me see if I can open it.
It's a very large file.
Sorry, I think, hi Janessa, if you're hearing us now, do you have the file so Trevor doesn't have to send it to me?
Yeah, I'm downloading it now.
Okay, thank you.
And I've been on every training there is. And it's just not working. Try sharing the entire desktop.
You can try that if you want, if you haven't got too much else going on. You may try it while Janessa is downloading the presentation.
So how do I do that? What's different about that? Oh, something's happening.
Yeah, so now so we
ya lo podemos ver.
well. Sí, lo podemos ver. We can see it now.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Sí, Janessa está compartiendo.
Ah, okay. Yeah, Janessa is sharing. Pilar said, thank you, Pilar.
Okay, I can't see it, but.
If you go to presentation, if you toggle between live video and presentation, right underneath the logo, Kudo on the left.
It's not letting me. Something's going on here.
Do you want to refresh, Trevor, quickly? It might
Okay.
just be you, and I'll accept you right away.
Now I can see it. Everything's fine. Okay,
thank you.
Let's go. So I'm going to go pretty fast. So the opening slide. So I'm going to tell a story about basically from the global level. So some of it will have to do with the Latin American region, and some of it has to do with our overall effort to make a splash on the international stage. Next slide, please. So I want to acknowledge the estimated 476 million Indigenous peoples living in approximately 90 countries around the world, representing around 5,000 different Indigenous cultures. I want to especially acknowledge the unceded land of the Ramaytush Ohlone and the confederated villages of the Lisjan Ohlone peoples, neighbored by the Muwekma Ohlone, Costanoan Esalen, Rumsen, and Mutsun Ohlone. So they're the Ohlone peoples, but of course there's many different factions within. There's different groups within the Ohlone nation. So next slide, please. Just so you know, the path leading to IGUA, or in Spanish, El Jetives, has been going on for about 3 decades now, with some of the first meetings happening in Montreal in 1989. Next slide, please. And as I said, I'm going to be telling a story, and we're telling our own story. It's in the spirit of nothing about us without us. When others tell our story, the story of Indigenous peoples, they often use words that are hurtful to us, calling, poor and, bad health and undereducated. And when you ask Indigenous people to describe themselves, you get strength-based words like positive, mom, bonds, elders, support, relations, togetherness. So this is our story told by us. Next slide, please. So there's some early collective action, and that is from 1989 at the International AIDS Conference. And this is before the age of antiretroviral treatment, when basically you got HIV and you were okay for a while, and eventually you started getting sick, and many of us died in some very, very nasty ways. I've been living with HIV for 30 years. I remember those days, those demonstrations of desperation. And for the newer generations coming in, for those without access to medications, it's still like that. And we need to be strong, and our voices need, we need not to take no for an answer. We need to insist. So next slide, please. So there's the Toronto Charter. That's the first time Indigenous people spoke on a global level to the rest of the world. And in 2005, there was a international call for Indigenous peoples, and they all came together in Toronto and planned for the very first international pre-conference on HIV/AIDS before AIDS 2006 in Toronto. And in preparation for that, prepared the Toronto Charter. Well, next slide, please. And there's the logo for the International AIDS Conference in 2006. And the two-spirited people of the First Nations, the Ontario Aboriginal HIV/AIDS Strategy, and the Canadian Aboriginal AIDS Network partnered together to host the very first Indigenous Peoples Networking Zone in the Global Village at AIDS 2006, and also held their first pre-conference, as I mentioned. Next slide, please. So there's a list of some of the very important landmarks that have happened. There's the Toronto Charter, as I said, in 2005, the 2006 pre-conference at AIDS 2006. Amaranta and Jose were mentioning the pre-conference that happened in Mexico. And 2010, we were in Vienna, 2012 in Washington, 2014 in Melbourne and Sydney, 2016 in Durban, and then a couple of years ago, we were in Amsterdam. Next slide, please. And there's 2010. Yeah, obviously in Vienna, we didn't have any Indigenous partners living in the territory. And so that really gave us a chance to focus on strategic planning. Up till that point, there was no strategy, and there was no concerted effort to actually do this in a strategic planning kind of way. So the group there, I was involved in that, but I wasn't the coordinator at that time, but I helped contribute to the planning. Next slide, please. So what came out of it was the International Strategic Plan on HIV and AIDS. And the year after, in 2011, I was hired to look at this big, tall pile of papers, which contained not only stuff about the strategic plan, it also contained a lot of stuff about how the group wanted to govern itself. So what happened is I had to pull it apart, and we created the terms of reference. And on the other hand, we had the strategic plan, and we implemented that strategic plan. And there was a piece in there, oh, next slide, please, pardon me. And the objectives. Of course, even now, we're still using objective number 1 to increase the visibility and impact of HIV and AIDS in Indigenous communities at the international level. We wanted to improve the meaningful inclusion of Indigenous peoples and Indigenous peoples living with HIV and AIDS in research, policy, program development at the national, regional, international level. We also wanted to work towards the accurate representation of Indigenous peoples in HIV and AIDS epidemiological data within their own countries or regions. That's still a struggle to this day. We're still doing that. Next slide, please. We also work toward providing capacity building and development to raise HIV and AIDS and Indigenous peoples as a health priority, promote Indigenous specific approaches to the social determinants of health. And the sixth one was conduct sustainability planning, which was particularly important because one of the activities within the sustainability piece was to develop IGWA into an international NGO, an organization, a legal entity. Next slide, please. So there we are in Washington, D.C., the year after we had our strategic plan. And this is at AIDS 2012. We had a networking zone, which is a nice big space where we put up a teepee on one half, and the other half we had like a workshop area, classroom style kind of setup where we talked about harm reduction, we talked about treatment and access, we talked about Indigenous medicine, we had talking circles, we had data, we had cultural sharing. It's really it's a lot different than being online like we are now, I can tell you that. When Indigenous people get together, like Jose said, looking at what your face is saying and telling me, it's just such a different connection, and we're trying to capture that here, but of course it's quite difficult. Next slide, please. And there we are at the pre-conference. So that was before AIDS 2012. We went to a hotel room and we claimed Indigenous territory right in the lobby of the hotel in Washington, D.C. with this very cool, this was a research project. This is data. And this is about Indigenous ways of knowing and doing, where many Indigenous women in Canada who were living with HIV were given cameras to take photographs and produce the photographs with a description of how that photograph represented their lives living with HIV. And of course, it was very structured, but the data that came out of that was extremely robust, a lot more so than the normal way of having online surveys and focus groups and interviews, etc. So this is something that's still going. Visioning Health 2 came along and it went, it's a very successful project, which I hope is duplicated in other parts of the world. Next slide, please. And we're still in Washington, D.C., a condom man, an Indigenous superhero that promotes condoms, and his the other superhero was Lubalicious. And on the left, you can see all in the background, there's all these different superheroes, and they're all representing different sexually transmitted infections. And these are Aboriginal, Indigenous people from Australia and the Torres Strait Islands, from Australia, and it was, humor was a good part of it, and this is a great way to reach youth as well. Next slide, please. So it's not just the international AIDS conferences where we engage. Here we are at the International Union of Health Promotion and Education Conference in Pattaya, Thailand. And there's Dr. Clive Aspen giving a presentation. We were sharing the achievements, very similar to this presentation here, but this was back in 2013. And what we realized, but the feedback we were getting, is that as much as we felt like maybe we were tripping over our own shoelaces, they let us know that as far as they knew, the people there in the room, that we were further advanced than any other global community Indigenous health response. Other than what's going on at the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues at the UN in New York, we were quite far ahead, and we didn't realize that when it's so difficult and you're struggling and swimming upstream and everything seems like a battle, you forget that you're actually making a little progress. So it was a very good feeling that we had coming out of there. Next slide, please. And we started to engage at the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. We went in May of 2013. We partnered with a group called the Native Youth Sexual Health Network. And we wrote an intervention. Basically, we tried to get to the microphone, but we didn't get a chance. We kept getting bumped off the end. And so at the end, we ran with our paper and we handed it to the inner circle of the members of the Permanent Forum. And our recommendation became part of the final report. And we asked for an expert group meeting on sexual health and reproductive rights. And it happened the next year. And some of our leaders were invited to do presentations on HIV and sexual health, etc. Now, the problem is that many of these reports can just sit on the shelves and the recommendations are not followed. So I do feel that that's what happened with this. So, you know, later on, we learned a lesson from that, that yes, it's great to have a lot of recommendations in a book, but if no one does anything, it's kind of a waste of time. We're just talking to each other. We're not taking action. Next slide, please. So then I think Jose talked about this when we went down to Guatemala and we developed that research ethical protocol. And it's called Conducting Research on HIV Among Indigenous Peoples, Values, Approaches, and Guidelines. Basically, you know, of course we need disaggregated epidemiological HIV data, but we also realize that if we are just doing it the same way as the colonizers are doing it, then we are colonizing each other. So we needed to have an ethical cornerstone, something to build upon so that we could go forward and do it right and make sure that, and hope that this becomes the gold standard for doing research with Indigenous peoples. Next slide. And there we are in Quetzaltenango in Guatemala, and Jose was so kind and put on a very traditional performance for us. And we didn't really know what was going on at all. And yet we were out there dancing with these different characters. And at the end of it, we were educated. It was a cultural sharing, and I still remember it to this day. And I wish I had time to show you the video. So next slide, please. So advance to Melbourne. The Australian people in Melbourne were able to secure a great deal of money from different levels of government there. The year before, in 2013, a delegation of the leaders of IGWA went to Australia, and we visited Melbourne, Canberra, the capital, and Sydney, Australia. And we spoke with the health ministries. We spoke with other civil society partners in key populations. We spoke with sex worker groups. We spoke with men who have sex with men or gay groups. We spoke with trans people. You know, we did the whole gamut, and other AIDS organizations too. So the result was that they realized that yes, they were connected internationally, and this is a real thing, and they were able to secure funding from the government. They were strong, the Indigenous Aboriginal people from Australia. They did most of the organizing, and basically my job was just to remind them, remember it's an international conference and we have to keep the international content, because the Australian cultural component and was so beautiful and so strong. It was a challenge to make it international. And this is our this is the pre-conference that you're seeing on the left, and on the right is the Indigenous Peoples Networking Zone. Next slide, please. And this that was the logo, and it was also a time to release the Eora call to action, which was a national call to action around HIV and AIDS, and it was around. It wasn't an international one, but it was very important because, again, Indigenous people were speaking to the nation and speaking to the world, letting them know that not enough is being done, and if we don't do something, HIV/AIDS is going to increase in Indigenous communities. And lo and behold, it actually did increase. So we're seeing increasing rates now. Next slide, please. And this is another project that we did. And we received some money from the government of Canada to look at some of the progress that's being made toward achieving global targets. And it was more than just HIV. It was also tuberculosis, viral hepatitis, and sexually transmitted infections. So there was a face-to-face meeting in Ottawa, Ontario, and there was a lot of literature review and research that went into this, and a report was developed with a lot of recommendations, and we are still looking to implement that. And I believe the host organization of IGWA, the Canadian Aboriginal AIDS Network, you see their logo there, they are looking to implement some of the recommendations to show a good example. Next slide, please. Though this is another thing that we got engaged with, and every 5 years or so there have been these high-level meetings on HIV at the United Nations General Assembly. The last one was in 2016. The next one might be next year. You can see I was actually representing the UN AIDS NGO delegation at this meeting, and I got on a call, and Madama Paula, who was a leader a few years ago from New Zealand, was also representing, I believe, ICW, the International Community of Women Living with HIV. So there were two of us there, Indigenous. I nominated Madama as a co-chair, and she became the co-chair of the Stakeholders Task Force. And what we were able to do is get Indigenous peoples mentioned twice for the very first time ever in any high-level meeting. But again, there were no targets developed for Indigenous peoples. So, you know, it's slow steps, and, you know, doing this work on the international level is a little bit like riding a glacier, you know, yeah, let's go, come on, you can do it, faster, faster. So, you know, while people are dying, more Indigenous people are getting HIV, we have to be patient at the same time. Urgency, yes, but patience and diplomacy as well at the international level. I'm sorry to say it can be very slow, and it can be very frustrating. Next slide, please. Fast forward to Durban, South Africa. Here we are. There's the Minister of Health in the networking zone of in the global village. Next slide, please. I think I'll start going through these pretty fast. Here we are. And Janessa, I'm going to ask you to flip through these quickly, and I'll let you know when. These are the Zulu maidens, and you'll never know who you're going to meet at a pre-conference for Indigenous peoples. They did an excellent performance. They are all young women. They must be approaching their 20s by now, and they just love taking photographs. You can see they're all just posing there. But I was having such fun, and then I got a call from the convention center in Durban saying they won't let us in. So our partners were trying to get into the global village to build up our networking zone. And next slide, please. I'll show you. I ran over there, and there's what I found. There was the delivery for the networking zone. I'm like, oh my God, there's straw and wood. Next slide, please. So there I am, all dressed up perfectly for carrying straw and wood around in my tie and my suit. Next slide, please. And there we are, carrying poles and stuff. Let's flip through the next one. There's the buildup. They started hammering and drilling. Next slide, please. And there we got more progress. It's building higher and higher. Next slide. And you can see the roof's going on now, and some of the straws going on. Next slide. There it is, a little bit of finishing touches and brushing the hair on the top, the straw, and making it all nice and smooth. Next slide. And then safety first, you know, they wanted us to spray it down with fire retardant because we didn't even get the proper permit to do this. And somehow I was able to convince them to let us keep going. I just told them, keep building, keep building. I'll take care of these guys with the ties. So there we are, welcoming our guests to the networking zone. Again, this is Jane Philpott, who was the Minister of Health for Canada. The Minister of Health for South Africa also visited us here. Next slide, please. And you can see that was the medicine woman sharing teachings from South Africa with the different people. And we had 4 days of programming. And that's what our networking zone would look like, similar in San Francisco or Oakland, had we had the luxury of going there in person. Next slide, please. So there we were in Durban again, and it was 2016. So the very next year was 2017, when our strategic plan would be sunsetting. So we needed to have another plan. So we drew a picture of a tree with roots and with a trunk and branches. And then we made different colored papers to show the leaves and the roots and the fruit. And we populated our living tree with our values. And with our goals, with our objectives, and with our activities, and we populated and made that tree into a living thing. Next slide, please. And the result was that the following year we came out with the International Strategic Plan from 2018 to 2024, pardon me. And we evaluated how well did we do in the first strategic plan, and what lessons did we learn. Because there were things in the strategic plan that we didn't do. There were also lots that we did that was not in the strategic plan, because early on we didn't realize how important it was. Things like securing positions of influence on other organizations where you're representing Indigenous peoples and you're on a decision-making body. Next slide, please. There we are in 2018 in Amsterdam. Again, no local Indigenous partners. The closest Indigenous peoples were the Sami, and we had Sami representation from Norway. One of our leaders is from Norway. And as you can see there, Michel Sidibe, the old executive director of UNAIDS, was there and did a keynote speech. And other people were there from the World Health Organization, from PAHO, from the International Labor Organization. So it really showed that we had been making some progress in building relationships. Next slide, please. And there we are again at the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, and there's Pilar and Marama and myself, and we were just about to give an intervention on the floor. Next slide. Now, this is pretty important. This is the United Nations, the joint United Nations program on HIV and AIDS. And of course, they have a program coordinating board with a big circle of all these different countries. But this UNAIDS is unique in the sense that they have an NGO delegation. And we don't just, they don't just provide advice, they can propose action points, you know, and also make deletions and go into the back rooms and go into the negotiations. So we have a lot of power civil society has on this board. And UNAIDS has, the board has 11 UN agency co-sponsors. And so like the International Labor Organization, the WHO, they have 11 of them. And my 3-year term there, I was able to develop relationships with a lot of the leaders there. So let's keep going. I'm almost done. Little scroll up, there you go. Okay, so last year we went to Mexico City. This was before the big COVID lockdown. And the community liaison came walking up to me, and she happens to be Indigenous, and she said, so what kind of civil disobedience are you going to do while you're here? And I said, I don't know, we don't have any planned. And she said, well, how about you interrupt the open ceremony? And I said, okay. Oh. And that's what we did. So Amaranta ran out and created that banner in about 3 or 4 hours. And we wrote up a statement that we built from something called the 10-point statement, which was, again, a document where we spoke to the world, and it was a list of demands. And there we listed our demands. And the agreement was, and they knew we were going to do this, and they said, okay, so I'll make you a deal. If you do the demonstration at this time of day, you know, at this time, then we will we'll keep the microphone on, turned on. We will point the camera at you. We will point the lights at you and project your image on the big screen, as long as we'll give you 2 minutes. So that way it's a little bit choreographed, but at least we were able to get our point across, and we made the front page of a few of Mexico City's important papers. So next slide, please. And one of our latest studies we did with the International Labour Organization, we did interviews with Indigenous people living with HIV or with TB all around the world, and asked them about their experiences with stigma and discrimination. And we found out that there's a lot of it, and it's double for Indigenous. They get discriminated against because they're Indigenous and because they're living with HIV or TB. So that is on our website, igwa.org. Next slide, please. And I was talking about earlier about how in the original strategic plan, one of the activities was to develop into an NGO. So in 2016, there was an NGO committee of IGWA who worked very hard to incorporate and establish some bylaws, a finance policy. They released the 10-point statement, which I mentioned, which is a list of demands. And we became a civil society partner for AIDS 2018 and AIDS 2020. So we are, I hold a seat on the conference coordinating committee of AIDS 2020, which was a very big win for us so early on in such a little baby organization. Next slide, please. Scrolling up. There we go. So we developed a political statement, and that going into this conference, actually, and it's called Foundations for a Coordinated Global Response, HIV/AIDS and Indigenous Peoples. And a little later on, we'll share that link with you, or maybe you could throw the link up right now. The technicians will show the link there for the Foundations paper, which has 5 recommendations as well. And next slide, please. I think I'm pretty much done here. Yes, there we are. We're civil society partners on the Conference Coordinating Committee, and I really hope you enjoy AIDS 2020 and come and visit us at the Indigenous Peoples Networking Zone, and also at the NGO booth for the International Indigenous HIV and AIDS community. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Trevor, por tu presentación, que nos has hecho todo un recorrido.
Thank you very much, Trevor, for your presentation. You've made a summary of all the journey from the very first call to action, all these achievements and lessons learned that we have made together in this long journey. I also want to thank you for the invitation for everyone to participate in the conference. There we have a space in the Global Village. Now I would like to convey some questions that have been made. I want to make a question specifically to Amaranta. Amaranta, how do you see the relationship between SIPLA, which is a Latin American organization, and IGWA? What do you think, what do you see in the future of this relationship? Thank you very much, Pilar. I think it's necessary to ask those questions these days. I think that both IGWA and SIPLA have worked together to build something since 1999 to date. Of course, within this, Mexico 2008 is included. We have made the foundations for instance, Jose's presentation, Trevor's presentation, my presentation. We have created a basis for opportunities. We have reached certain spaces so that we can instill the topic, we can have the topic addressed at the higher level. In the permanent forum of the UN, in the IIS, in the WHO, in the PAHO. I think we have a very important basis. We have research, we have data analysis. I think that moving forward, we should have a dialectic process, having a constant dialogue. I think we have to think of a joint effort. It has to be accelerated and joint. And we would have three main topics in this case. I think that the work group as well as SIPLA should think of a higher involvement of indigenous communities in this response. We have research, we have reports, we have experiences that were successful, some that were not so successful, but we have lessons learned. We have lessons learned that our brothers and sisters could use, understand, and therefore produce better responses. I think, Pilar, that perhaps for Latin America, we would also have the support of IWA. And in Latin America, we should, what do you call it? We should have a support to prepare new indigenous leaders in Latin America. We could pass on the expertise we already have in the region. We could leverage IWA's expertise. Therefore, we could generate a renewal circle with new leadership. That, I believe, will strengthen our work significantly. Something that I believe is very significant is the absence of resources, the lack of resources. I think that a joint effort needs to mobilize resources, not only economical resources, but also technical resources, political resources, relations so that we can sensitize our governments, to give an example. We would need to democratize resources, and those should be the next steps moving forward. And I would conclude with the fact that if we can guarantee a higher involvement and more resources, more mobilization of resources, we could have better public policies regarding prevention and access at the local level. We need to do more work. We need to work more with our local leaderships, with other chiefs, with other leaders, with other midwives, as Jose was saying, with the health centers, the local and community health centers. There, we need to apply all this learning. But the first two conditions is having higher involvement and engagement and better support regarding resources. I think that we could align our cooperation and relation towards that end. Thank you very much, Amaranta. Now, along that line of what you said, I would like to ask a question to Jose Yak. How do you see in this new leadership the participation of boys, girls, and youth, indigenous boys, girls, and youth? Thank you very much, Pilar. I would say it's not only a need, it's also a right. These populations need to be included. As a matter of fact, in Mexico in 2008, we worked together with other Latin American and Caribbean organizations to generate the Latin American and Caribbean Network for Boys, Girls, and Youth. It is the Latin American Network for Boys and Girls for HIV. The aim of this organization was to work together with other organizations that were working with children. The idea was that there is a group, the Canadian organization that was generating the symposiums, working on children, on pregnant women, etc. This Canadian organization was facing some challenges, and it had some models that could be applied to make sure children did receive care, did have access to care, and therefore this Latin American network for children and with HIV was being able to have an involvement in public policies and in decision making. And we took the 1989 Children's Rights Chart by the UN, and we underlined that one of the main pillars was moving resources for children. And that fight included listening to children. In Guatemala, particularly, we did the Guatemaltecan Department for Children, and we also have the Parliament for Children and Adolescents. The idea of this organization was to have children and adolescents speak about the realities. We wanted to change the viewpoint of the Ministry of Health. Unfortunately, the Ministry of Health only provides a course on reproductive organs, but it does not include the world vision of the different peoples. And some children may have never seen a penis or a vagina, for instance, and then they would go to school and they would see those. So that was very shocking. So we had to work and align their lives with what we needed to do. I don't know, perhaps UNICEF should try to retake this commitment and working in this aspect of children and HIV, because I don't think we're providing the right care and attention to this generation. Thank you very much, Jose. Finally, I want to give the floor to Trevor so that he can answer the question. Which are the 5 points of the basics for a global response for HIV and Indigenous people?
Thank you, Pilar. You know, when I was working with the writers on this paper, and incidentally, it's Jeffrey Roth, who is the North American representative on the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. He was the lead writer. And Mariam Abubakrin was also on the writing team, and she was chair of the Permanent Forum for 2 years. 4 years, that's 2 terms. And they had some assistants there too. And one of the things we said, we were trying to think, who is this message for? You know, who are we talking to? And then we thought, well, basically we're in a helicopter looking down over the land. And we're going, okay, there's some indigenous stuff happening there for TB and some HIV there. And there's some rejection here. People are getting kicked out of the community here or banished. And you know what? This isn't working. Who's coordinating all this? There's successes and challenges all over, but who's coordinating? Well, how can we get this together? How can we share our practices and stuff? So we realize we're probably speaking to the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations, under which the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues exists underneath that authority, as so does UNAIDS. And so we thought that there needs to be a higher body to coordinate these efforts. So the statement's a call for urgent action from the United Nations to convene partners to design an HIV implementation strategy to influence and engage countries, policymakers, and health agencies to understand the importance of correctly utilizing their efforts and investments on Indigenous health by utilizing an Indigenous-led model. And there are 5 recommendations, and I'll read them and then I'll be quiet. So the first one is to establish an epidemiological data baseline that is created from the ground up. It's culturally informed, and it maintains local Indigenous community ties, very much like the work we did in Guatemala with Jose and his team. The second one is to develop a system of health resources and educational curriculums grounded in Indigenous culture while exploring environmental and Indigenous research protocols. The third one is around creating regional Indigenous HIV/AIDS epidemiological baseline working groups of experts across the globe to provide oversight, guidance, and assistance. They're calling that the IHEB. They've created their own acronym in the paper. The fourth one is to implement all the recommendations with the goal of eradicating this pandemic. The results should foster, develop, and maintain relationships. That's that relationalism, you know, Indigenous people, it's so important. And do this to lead to a sustained presence for Indigenous HIV prevention and treatment activities. And fifth and finally, we need collaboration between the international Indigenous HIV and AIDS community and the United Nations Economic and Social Council leadership to bring their attention to the United Nations, the recommendations from the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, and to coordinate their implementation. So that's it. There's some pretty heavy hitting demands there, and it's very well thought out, and these are actionable. This is something the UN can pick up and take and go, that is clear. Now, you guys, how are we going to do this? That's the stage where we want to be next. So thank you, Pilar.
Gracias, Trevor.
Thank you, Trevor. Out of those 5 points that we think they are important, and I think that we have to focus on moving forward, I want to remind all attendants that there is a survey, and I would like all of them to complete that survey. Now, to conclude, I want to read some conclusions that we could hear throughout these almost 2 hours. Amaranta reviews and summarizes strong Latin American work with Indigenous peoples. This has been a vast work. But it is important for HIV in Indigenous communities.
Países ya han sumado además esfuerzos con otros.
They have started efforts in their countries, in their regions, and in the world, and also with other actors like UN organizations. SIPLA, for example, can be a tool that can be used for this. Jose tells us about the key actions that the International Secretariat for Indigenous Peoples and HIV, Sexuality and Human Rights, together with IGWA, have done in the context of the 90-90-90 goals. It's planting or sowing seeds. This is a tool which main value is to give the academic community and the government's guidance for all the actions in the development, design, and implementation of the research, which must ensure the inclusion and participation of Indigenous peoples. He also mentions that it is necessary to understand how Indigenous peoples live, how they move, what is their world vision, and not only from an epidemiological point of view, as well as to recognize the Indigenous people's capacity to be part of the response at the national, regional, and global level. We need to make use of the practices and customs to prevent the epidemic with alternative means, for example, community radio, art, music, and Indigenous dances. Finally, Trevor addressed the history that the indigenous people have led in the world in order to strengthen IGWA, and the Toronto Charter in 2005 with its call to action aimed at people who have influence and are part of the decision-making process about the provision of HIV and AIDS services for indigenous peoples. He also talked about the different international spaces where leaders have had the chance to participate. For example, the planification of the satellite organization, and also in, for example, the 2006 conference in Toronto, and how this has been a challenge to incorporate the Latin American leaders starting in 2008. He also talked about the strategic plan 2011-2017, which was a fast-track building to increase the dialogue with the different agencies of the United Nations. He also talked about the learnings in the last years and how is it important to have a strong group of indigenous peoples, to have committed leaders. And he talks about these bases as a political declaration for the WISER 2020. It is an effort, a global effort to eliminate HIV in the indigenous peoples communities. Thank you, Amaranta. Thank you, Jose. Thank you, Trevor, for being here with us and being part of this session that has been wonderful for everyone. Thank you very much.